Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we are going to be reviewing People We Meet on Vacation. This is a rom-com from 2026, so very fresh, very new, and a bit of an interesting take on a few things. An attempt at trying something new, trying to mix up the formula a little bit, and take things in a bit of a different direction. Not a huge amount of well-known actors in this one, which can be good, can be bad. But let's take a look. So starting with that casting, let's dive into that cast a bit more. Yeah, nobody really stand out to me that has any particular major roles that I know from the past. So quite a lot of fresh faces for me. I think Tom Blythe in the main role, I think he was good. I think he wasn't anything exceptional, but he was good. And he was a little bit of a standout for me in this movie. I think he suited this role well. Maybe not anything more than that. And I think, unfortunately, I think everyone else was a little bit lost for a couple of reasons. One, because, again, they felt very generic, and I don't think they were given enough to really be memorable. I think there was a lot of deliberate choices here because they wanted to keep the cast very small and so really focused in. But definitely, I think there needed to be more for a couple of reasons, which we will come to as we reach the other parts. Emily, the main co-star here, yeah, casting-wise, I'm really not sure. I think that she's not quite a bad choice, but not really a good choice either. And so that kind of neutral theme it kind of stays throughout. So, what that means is, while the main character was good, there wasn't enough of the pull from anyone else to reach that 4. So we are looking at 3 or 2. There were a few bad marks pulling it down, but that feels like it was more of an issue in other parts, maybe the production, maybe the script, and we'll talk about it a little bit more there. And I don't think it was really an issue of the casting. And so for the moment, we are going to leave it in that 3 zone. Mainly because of, I think, the main character just pulling it up a little bit. I think if he wasn't quite as good and a standout as he was, then it would be in that 2 category because of the other parts pulling it down. Into production. I think I have a lot to say about the production here. They definitely wanted to do a few things a little bit differently here. They had I would say 2 key elements that they tried to push thematically and keep throughout the movie. The first is how they wanted to lay it out, and they used the production to do that. They wanted to kind of use the production to tell the timeline a bit with different locations and with this kind of timeline of highlighting the different summers that things were happening. Yeah, there's definitely been other people trying to do things from this perspective, from jumping around in time and highlighting it in different places, but nobody's quite done it like this. And I don't think it really worked. It didn't work because there wasn't enough context. There wasn't enough of them setting it. And so it got lost in a lot of places. And we'll definitely keep revisiting this point because we're going to talk about that in the script because it's paired with the script. They're using that production element to try and tell this story, but it's not enough to ground you in what's happening. So it is a failing on the script, and we'll come to that, but it is also a failing on the production. Um, and I think it was because they were trying something new. They didn't want to go all in on it. But I think if you're going to make that choice and do these different things in a movie where you're trying to tell it in a different style, you've got to go all in on it. Otherwise, you end up with what happened, which is that there's not enough. There's not enough scene setting, and there's not enough context, and there's not enough differential with the things that they're showing us. So we'll start to talk about the actual layout of the locations now, because that was a very big part in this movie. You know, it was based around a character who travels for a living. You know, the whole kind of premise, you know, it's called People We Meet on Vacation. It's all about vacations and where people are going and things. For a movie that's called that, they didn't do enough to sell those vacations, as it were, to sell those sets of the different places that we were. And I think maybe that's a budgeting issue. Maybe they didn't, you know, it felt like a smaller budgeted movie, and it felt like they were trying to keep it more focused on the romance side of it. But if you're going to call it People We Meet on Vacation, if you're going to have these vacations be the theme throughout, that's kind of moving the story and moving all of these parts forward, you've got to sell that. And if you don't have what you need to sell that, you have to either change it because it's not going to work, or do it in a different way because you're not giving the main theme that you want people to engage with your movie about enough. You know, they were in all these different places. You know, they were in Italy, they were in Canada, even the road trip through America. You know, they had Italy and Spain at the end. They jumped around a lot, but they didn't sell the places. You know, if you're going to have this where you're jumping around and you're in all these different places, you've got to really set yourself in those places and give the people the connection to that. And that wasn't done. So it's not going to score too highly because of these things that they're trying that they didn't really achieve. However, I don't want to penalize them over the top because they're still trying something new, and I want people to explore these edges because otherwise things are going to be very boring, and that's the last thing that we want. So I would say we're looking at a 4 or a 3 here because they did not do the things that they needed to, and they failed in what they were trying to achieve. But they were breaking the mold. They were trying to deliver, you know, the rom-com is a very repetitive kind of formula, and they're trying to break away from that repetitive angle, which is a good thing. So I think we're going to call it at a 5 for being adventurous, but it just failed. I think even that, I feel like is really generous. And I'm worried whether it's too generous. It's a 3 really, and maybe we should call it a 4. Um, yeah, I think we're gonna do that because there were more problems in other places, but it was affected because of this, and the other parts have their own good pluses and minuses to help with that. So 4 for production. It was not horrible, but if you're going to have these feature elements to your movie, you have to feature the feature elements. It's rule 1. That's why it's called that. Okay, so tying that into the script. The biggest bugbear for this movie, and is generally a rule for these kind of movies, is how they jumped around in time. Jumping around in time has all sorts of issues. If you're, I think they went from past to present to past to present maybe 9 times. That in itself isn't an issue, but how you do it is. If you've got 2 timelines in a movie, that's okay. That happens, and there are movies that have done that really well. But you have to really do certain things in a very strict way to avoid the problems that come with that. The number one problem is your audience getting lost. And this movie has a huge issue with that in the setup, because the whole premise of the movie, I feel like, is lost until about halfway through, because you're spending so much time thinking to yourself, what is this really about? Are they actually together? Did something happen that we didn't see? And that is the choice that they made, to do it in such a segmented fashion. If they had made a different choice, if they had just given you all of the pre-information up front rather than going backwards and forwards, this movie would have been completely different. And I feel so much more enjoyable, because there was no reason, really, for them to need to keep going backwards and forwards. So they could have simply had all this build up, because that's what it is. It's the build up and the context for these 2 people and why they're want to be together but they're not together in this past information. And so if you just deliver that at the beginning, then we've got that context, we've got that connection of, okay, these guys want to be together, but they're not for all of these different reasons and all of these different things that are happening, and it just makes sense to you because you've got that information. But when you piecemeal it out and you keep coming back to the present, there's so many times where you're left wondering, well, why is she making such a big deal about this? Why is he doing this, that, and the other? What is the reason why she was so on the fence about going to this wedding? And it's because the information isn't there. And the problem with that is not that it's a bad thing that you don't have all the information. The problem is that it's such an issue because you don't have the connection to them as an audience member to relate to the things that they're saying. And so that detracts from both the story and the acting that they're giving to you, because you can't relate to them because they haven't given you the part that relates you to it. So that's a pretty big flaw from the get-go of just a choice that they've made. now that I have all the information and I can look back on it, now we have to actually look at whether that in itself is a good story. Whew. And that is a whole question onto itself. And I feel like the answer is really no. Are you going to wait for a person for 9 years? You're seeing a person once a year for about a week for 9 years. There's a little bit of chemistry there, but it's not enough for you to actually have a pull together. So there's two questions. If there are going to be people that are just doing this, they're making this choice. Okay, once a year, we're going to see each other to do this unique thing, and that's interesting, and I get it. But two things are going to happen. One, you're either going to reach this point where you're going to say, okay, I see this person once a year, and I'm interested enough, so I'm going to make that move to try and get something more from that. And that's either going to drive you to make that decision, or you're just going to say, fuck, enough of my life has passed. I'm not going to do that. And so, okay, I'm going to continue with this enjoyable thing because I've got this enjoyable element. But are you really going to have an emotional connection with somebody on once a week, a year? That feels implausible to me. You've got these other elements going on in your life, and they kept talking about that, you know. He had an off again, on again, off again relationship that was kind of going on throughout, and she kept going through all these failed relationships, and that was because of these two people that they were, and they're already incredibly different people. They did not build enough of that relationship, of that connection between these two people, for you to believe that after 9 years of this small amount of contact between them, that would actually build enough of an emotional connection with them. And maybe that's because they're not showing us the things that's happening outside of that 1 week a year that they're seeing each other. You know, they're not showing us how they're still talking. They're not showing us the build up to them wanting to go away on a vacation together. They're not showing us all those other parts. So they're only showing us this little snippet, and it's like, okay, you had this interesting vocation, you had these interesting things that happened. You're doing it because you're different people and you're wanting to bring different experiences to each other. Sure, you know, all of that I buy. What I don't buy is that, okay, I'm emotionally invested in you now, but I'm going to wait and not act on that this year. Okay, next year, now there's emotional connection again, but I'm still not going to act on it again this year. Okay, next year is another emotional connection, but again, I'm not going to act on it. So it's like either that is building and they're going to act on it, or 9 years has passed and so there's not an emotional connection, because 9 fucking years of your life waiting on a person that you see once a year, I don't know. They didn't sell it to me. Now, relating that to the actual characters, there was a few other moments that were also an issue because, as I said, these guys are opposites. He's a homebody and she's an outgoing go-getter that's into the kind of crazy adventures that can happen that come with that spontaneity in the moment. And so I can believe there's these things pulling them together because of these opposites, and opposites attract. That's great. I get that. And I can believe that they're in this situation because they're both wanting to add things to each other's lives, because that's that happens. That's natural. What I didn't see was the other side. We saw it on one side. We saw her outgoingness rubbing off on him. We did not see enough of his caution, his planning, and his organization rubbing off on her. And for, again, you as an audience member to buy this emotional connection, you have to see both of them engaging with each other and not one-sided. Now, I think if we go into that more, we're going into the acting side of things, and we want to keep it to the script. So the script is just about the believability of these characters as written. And so there's issues with that again. So in 3 different places, I feel like they have failed to write believable moments, believable plot points, believable characters that are actually achieving these things. And so, in my mind, the script is actually where there's the most problems. And it's not because I don't think it works, because I think it's possible. I think it's just that they didn't give us enough for them to sell that it's happened. And that's the point. It's the selling that it's happened. So, what that means is that the minor points have got holes in them, and the major points, the overarching theme, has got holes in them. Again, they've tried to redistribute the story a little bit to make it a bit different, but it's really not enough. So I think we are looking at a 5. No, I think we're looking at a 4, with me putting it up to a 5 for them trying something new. I really don't think we can do any more than that, just because they haven't given us enough. And that is in the storytelling. That's the problem. That is in the script. They haven't put enough there. Whew. So, now let's get into the acting of how that was portrayed. We know that story-wise they haven't given us enough, but what was there, how that was portrayed. So now we're going to come back to our main character, Tom Blythe, playing Alex. He was a real standout for me in this, and for a couple of reasons. I think he did an exceptional job of delivering this kind of somewhat cautious, reclusive character who was kind of brought out of his shell a little bit and fell in love with somebody who, frankly, from his perspective, must have been crazy at the beginning. And that craziness grew into some love. I think he did really well in achieving that. On the other end, Emily Bader, playing Poppy, she did a good job of playing this person who was really didn't want to be tied down and really wanted to be that kind of free-spirited, open-aired, live for the adventure person because of the fears of being tied down, of those commitments and what might happen. I think she did that really well, and I think it's a hard role. I don't think that comes naturally to a lot of people. I haven't seen her in a lot of things to know whether that's because that is part of her natural disposition and she's displaying that well, or whether that's because she's got the range to do something else and she's now achieving this difficult role. But what I didn't see, which is the issue, is, as I say, is that growth on that side of how she changed because of him, of how she started to be more cautious about things. They touched on it, but she didn't show it to me enough. Maybe that's because they didn't show her being afraid of certain things, or it just wasn't enough to show that he affected her, and so that kind of affection from her growed in him, and it was too kind of held back on her end, and I think that affected their overall chemistry of the believability of them ending up together. And so, that kind of ending of her leaving her job, it felt like she, as a person, right? If I saw a person doing that and behaving the way that she behaved, in my mind, she's doing that because she feels she has to, not because she is over the head, you know, lost in love with this person. And that's not what you want from a rom-com, because you've got to have that emotional engagement. So definitely not as many problems here as some of the other places, but one person is outshining the other person, and that's, I think that really comes across on screen. She's not quite got the presence to match his level. So, advanced emotions, interesting handling, good group dynamics. But we are not fulfilling. Oh, bless me. We are not fulfilling everything that we need for that good character development and strong chemistry. So we are kind of reaching the top end here and not quite reaching into here. So I'm going to say 44. It's a good attempt at trying to bring something new and do these different elements with what it is a very narrow category and formula for that rom-com story, but it has fallen short by overall the failings of the script and the lack of commitment in production and casting to meet the demands of that movie, really. So I would love to see something similarly tried again to make that work. I think overall the feeling when you're watching that movie, or at least for me, maybe not for other people, is it's unsatisfying. Unsatisfying because of some of the choices that they've made, and unsatisfying because of some of the unbelievable elements. And I think those unbelievable elements are just because they've not given you enough to achieve that. And I think whenever you've got movies like that, it means that the smaller pieces that maybe would have gone unnoticed, product placement and things, become a bit more obvious, and it's never good when you can really see those product placements. That really detracts from the overall enjoyment of a film. Okay, so let's see how it ends up. Overall, that scored quite poorly in a few categories, and we're looking at 56. 56 does feel generous to myself, and I think that's because of a few things, but a few new things that they've tried, and a leading actor kind of punching a bit above his weight in terms of the other elements of the movie. So I guess that's fair. So, not a bad film, but not a good film either. Bearable. I'm not going to be rushing to see this again, or maybe ever. But do give it a watch. See if you agree with my findings, whether you struggled with the same things that I struggled with, and whether you enjoyed it or not at the end. So, subscribe to see what our next review is, and leave a comment of what movie you think I should review and where you think it will come. Thanks for joining me, and I'll catch you guys next time.